now.
Gentlemen, thank you so very much for coming this evening. I really do appreciate it, and we hope you enjoy this. We've got a great presenter tonight. Before I introduce him, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. Number one, I've got to make an apology for myself to Larry Knapp and to Fred Marin, because in my current article I wrote for about OM30 and O-Scale Resource Magazine, some of the photos and some of the text of Larry's got put in Fred's profile, and it was my fault. I missed it when I proofed the final version, and I'm really sorry. So I've apologized to Larry on my Facebook page, but I did want to mention it again tonight. It's something that just shouldn't have happened. Also, I'd like to have Jack talk to us for just a few minutes. Jack was the featured modeler a couple of times ago, and you may remember he has these great HO structures that grudgingly he has agreed to offer in O-Scale. And I wanted to give him an opportunity to tell us about his new products that are coming out in September, I believe, Jack. So please give us a little information.
Sure. Yes, Jim is very persuasive and very persistent. I've had folks over time, ask about O-Scale, and I've always shied away from doing it.
I think we just lost Jack.
Quick, find him.
Can you hear me?
You just cut out for a second, Jack.
My
Let me
kits
spotlight you real quick.
I developed craftsman kits. So far, just HO. I've started into N, and later this summer, August, September, I'll be releasing my first 3 O-Scale kits. This is the Union Freight House, which is based upon the actual freight house that still exists in Union, New Hampshire. This is the HO scale version. So that will be released in O-Scale.
Will you make it an N scale at some point? Jack, I'm an N scale person. Are you going to make that an N scale?
Is this soon enough?
Well, if you can't make an N scale, I'll buy it from you.
It's right here. You got it.
Oh, okay.
You're going to the dark side now.
Hey, it's not dark on this side. I live in Florida.
To be fair, the dark side has cookies.
Hey, James, give me Jack's information, will you please?
Yeah, you can order the N scale as we speak on the website ipswichhobbies.com. If you can spell Ipswich, you can get there. And
Jack,
I'm sorry, what was that again?
Jack, spell your website's name.
sure, IPSWICH, as in Ipswich, Massachusetts, Ipswich Hobbies. So it's IPSWICHHOBBIES.com, ipswichhobbies.com.
I can't spell. Can you put it in the chat room?
Sure, I'll figure that out. Okay. And,
Don't worry, I think I can spell it real quick. Give me a sec. I got you covered, Jack.
okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And these are the other two.
Sandy Hook, New Jersey.
These are the other 2 structures that will be coming out in O. This is the crossing shanty, based upon the actual shanty that's in presently in Ipswich, Massachusetts, at the Historical Society. And this is a section house that used to be in Ipswich, Massachusetts, but since been demolished. So these 2 line side structures will be also coming out in O-Scale in the next couple of months. And the smoke jacks are unique to B&M. I had those 3D printed.
Jack, I got one more question for you before I let you run here.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to write it up that you're a new manufacturer coming in O and put it in one of my articles coming up. I'm wondering how you would feel about offering another contest for that. a contest drawing to
Sure.
award one of your kits when you get them done to the winner of the contest drawing.
Yes, yeah. I think you mentioned that a few months ago. If I got to that point, and I'm getting to that point, so the answer is yes. Sure, we can talk about that.
Then I'll try to get it in the September issue for you. The other thing I want to mention to you, Jack, you have my home address to send me a copy of the kits, right? Thanks so much, Jack. I appreciate the information.
And I appreciate your sense of humor.
Okay, so real quick, I just want to bring something up real quick before we get over to Jim. We have a huge number of people in here tonight,
Craig.
which is great. A lot of new faces. And to those people who are new, welcome. I'm happy you're here because, frankly, we know we're doing something right if we're attracting this many people tonight. Just keep your mics on mute. You know, if you have a question, feel free to ask it. The only reason I say that is because all the background noise with this many people, it's just going to get out of control if everyone's mic is live. So if you don't mind, just making sure your mics are on mute, just so that way we're not picking up the background noise. And then if you have a question, you know, feel free to come off of mute and just ask it. Just want to make sure we cover our bases and everyone can actually hear what Jim's going to have to say.
And you
All
don't
right.
you don't want the occasion where a spouse says something in the background you wouldn't want repeated or heard. Let's put it that way.
And Phil, I sent you an email earlier today, I think. So, you know, whenever you get a chance, I'd appreciate it.
I'll get and look back. Just finally got back to my home office. So
Gotcha. So let me introduce Jim Gore. Jim is a professor, PhD in his field. He's an MMR. He's elected member of the NMRA, and he builds some fantastic models. I mean, he is in his field. He is one of the best modelers that I've ever seen. And he builds in a medium that I think is going to be new to some people. And Dylan, I don't know, I'm off for some reason.
No, we can hear you.
Can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Because what I'm seeing is a blank screen.
No, we can hear you and see you on this end, Jim.
Okay, that's fine. And Jim models in a medium that may not be familiar to everybody. It wasn't to me for a long time, and I wrote a couple of articles about it and profiled Jim in it, and he was kind enough to really help me understand the medium and understand how to model it. So with that, I'll turn it over to him. And Jim, I can't thank you enough for being here this evening.
Even though it says Sue Nichols, it's me. So I'm not exactly sure where I should start. I model in cardstock, not everything. Everybody seems to think that if I make anything, it's cardstock. It isn't. I enjoy a good Craftsman kit just like everybody else does. But cardstock, in my opinion, cardstock kits in particular, are the equivalent of a good Craftsman kit anyway. The problem is people tend to look at cardstock and think, well, that's one of those fill-in structures or that's one of those background structures. And I always, I taught computer modeling of biological systems, and we had a sign in our lab that said, you know, computer modeling of biological systems is fast, easy, and accurate. Pick any two. And the same thing happens with building with cardstock. It can be fast, it can be easy, but it won't be very accurate. So you really want to choose easy and accurate rather than fast and things like that. So anyway, cardstock is, as far as I'm concerned, an interesting medium. It's inexpensive, and at least with some manufacturers of cardstock, the nice thing about it is if you foul up, you just go to your printer and print another one and start again. And it probably costs you about 2.5, 3 cents. And so I brought a couple of models along to show you. I'll start off with this nice little easy one here. This is something called Flacos, and it was a kit that was given as a freebie from Clever Models. I'm modeling O scale, so it's big for me. But Flacos reminded me of when I lived in New Mexico. I grew up in New Mexico. We used to go down to a place in the valley in between Santa Fe and Espanola to get tamales for Christmas Eve, and it was a little place like this. And the other thing that points it out is that cardstock models can be detailed just like any other model can be detailed. And it's not one-dimensional. You can make it very three-dimensional. And so that's one of the things about modeling in cardstock, is that you have to learn a few new techniques, one of them being layering. A typical window, for example, may be 6 or 7 layers of cardstock. And once they're built up, they're as realistic as any other window. And as a matter of fact, they're closer to scale thickness than most of the plastic ones that you buy from, say, Tichy or Grant Line or San Juan now, but they're a little bit closer to the exact thickness. The other thing I like to point out, at least because I model at ON30 or O scale, is that there's a whole world of detail parts that come from doll manufacturers, because 1/4-inch doll manufacturing is a really great thing to use. So like the cups that you see sitting on the counter at Flacos come from a dollhouse. They are 1/4-inch scale, so they work just fine. So this is one. I tend to build my models on either 40 thousandths plastic or on gator foam, so that I can then put them on the layout and blend them into the scenery on my layout. Since I only moved to New Hampshire about 3 months ago, I'm nowhere close to my room of my new layout room, so everything's sitting on shelves. So you can kit bash these kits too. I'll show you. This is a restaurant that started off, at least as the kit goes, as a I think it was a bookstore, and it had one of those witch's cap turrets on it and things like that. I just bashed it around a little bit to make it into a restaurant. It has a completely lit interior. Can't see it very well, but it has a lit interior, and it's Miss Sue's fine tuning. That's my wife, Miss Sue. So here is a fairly typical cardstock structure, and it's the layers that give it the three-dimensionality. It's not a single bit of cardstock. It takes several days to do all of the layering. And you can scratch build with it too, because the manufacturers, at least there are several manufacturers who will sell you what they call textures, which are usually designed by CAD or in Photoshop, or I use GIMP because I'm too cheap to buy Photoshop. GIMP costs right now $4. It used to be free. It's a freeware version of Photoshop and works just as well. So you can even create your own textures if you want. I'll get back to that one. So here, for example, is a structure that's entirely kit built. This is a structure that is in Como, Colorado. This is the scale size of it. It's called the Diamond Bar, and I hold it up so that you can see the diamond and the bar. I first saw a picture of it, and somebody said, "Oh, this is a church in Como, Colorado." It's not a church, it's a bar, hence the name Diamond Bar. And half was a bar and half was a house of ill repute. Eventually this half, the brothel half, became a gas station until it was abandoned in the 1930s. But this is scale dimensions. It's the exact size of the original bar in Como. And of course, it's the details that are important. And it's, again, the textures. If you look at this, this is raised seam roofing, but each one of these individual seams is laid down on top of a printed sheet of what looks to be like steel or something like that. So there are lots and lots of layers on these windows, lots and lots of layers on doors, and everything else to give it that dimensionality. So I got started in cardstock modeling by accident when I first started building my ON30 layout, about 15, 16 years ago. I was looking at building something from the Southwest. And as a matter of fact, Jim Kello was one of the people who encouraged me. He may not remember, but he judged one of my Adobe structures that I had built out of balsa, and said it was really good modeling. At the time, I was incredibly embarrassed and honored at the same time. But that was 16, 17 years ago, I'm sure. But at any rate, about that time, I heard about cardstock. And at that time, there was a company called Paper Creek. And Paper Creek made, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 models in O scale, quite a few in HO. But I bought one of their O scale kits, and they laser cut them. All you had to do is cut the little frets and build the structure, and they gave you instructions on how to layer and everything else. So then I heard about, at that time it was called the Clever Brothers. It's now called Clever Models. And Clever Models, Clever Brothers had a kit that I thought was really interesting. It looked almost like Adobe, and it looked a little bit like an ice house I used to see in Santa Fe. So I bought it. It came in an envelope. Here were all the pieces, no frets, nothing. You had to cut the pieces out yourself. The more terrifying thing was there were no instructions, just all the pieces on about 10 or 15 sheets of paper. And so, quite frankly, I destroyed the thing. I couldn't get it together to save my soul because you had to figure it out all by yourself. And I sent the 2 Clever Brothers, Dave and Tom Michnikovsky, a email, and I said, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And they said, the kit was about $30. And they wrote back and they said, we're sorry, we'll refund your money. And I said, no, teach me how to do it right. And so over a period of about 3 weeks by email, we went back and forth, and they taught me how to model in cardstock. And about that time, they had almost decided to go out of business because one of the things that they had decided to build was a replica of John Allen's engine house on the Gore Undefeated, the engine house at Gore. And which I think was a really apocryphal kind of thing, because John Allen built that out of cardstock. That was where he introduced the concept of weathering. And so I said, gee, I'd really like a kit. And they said, well, it'll be about $125. And I said, for cardstock? And they said, yeah, that's what it's going to cost. And I said, there's got to be a different way to do it. And they said to me, well, tell you what, we'll send you the files. You build it if you document the build. And so over a period of about, I'd guess 6 months, it took me to build the O-scale version of the engine house at Gore. I built this thing, documented each step and everything else. And I think that's still on their website somewhere. But then they decided the way to sell it was not to sell by selling the kits, but by selling the files. And so that's what Clever Models does now, is to sell the files. You keep the files forever. If you want to build 100 versions of that kit, for example, you can do it because you keep the file forever. And the files run anywhere between, I'd say about $10 and about $30, $40 for some of the most complex kits. And so that's what I've started doing, is I've done some test builds for them. I'm kind of proud to say that the engine house at Gore appeared on the cover of O-scale trains probably 10 years ago or so. And I've been building a lot of things out of cardstock now. My most recent attempt is to build something out to make look like Adobe, but out of cardstock. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 3 or 4 days. This is in the process of being built. This is a granary, but it's cardstock. But I'm hoping that it looks like Adobe. I guess it remains to be seen after I get the roof and everything else on, but that's Adobe. The textures came from Tom and Dave Michnikovsky, and then I put them onto GIMP and altered them to my needs. And so that's where I stand with cardstock modeling. It's you need a lot of number 11 blades. You need a lot of patience, and if you want them to look good, you've got to detail them just like any other Craftsman kit. And you ought to expect to spend the same amount of time as you would if it were a Craftsman kit. Their textures cost, I think, about $1 a piece now. But there are a couple of other manufacturers who do Craftsman or do textures for cardstock. You know, but we seem to be sort of behind the process here, because Europeans have been building in cardstock for decades, actually centuries, and so have the Australian modelers, and so we're just sort of catching up. And there are a number of cardstock manufacturers in Australia. There are quite a few in Britain. There are a few in Europe. And most of them, one way or another, will sell you the files or sell you the kits, depending on the way they manufacture them. So I'm happy to talk to you or answer questions or anything else about cardstock modeling. Have at it. Oh, I see Craig Biscayer's there. Craig's a neat guy. He did one of my cardstock modeling, modeling with the Masters a few years ago. So nice to see you.
You are now doing this in O scale, 1/4 scale. How
Correct.
do we do this in S, which is 3/16?
Actually, that's quite easy. The Clever Models, for example, prints all of their kits in 1/4 inch scale, good architect scale. So it's always in O scale, but all you have to do is to tell your printer to print it at, if you wanted S scale, you would say print it in 48/64.
48/64.
That's S scale. If it were, if you wanted it printed in HO, you would ask it to print it in 48/87, for example, or 48/160 if you wanted in N scale. So it's just a matter of telling your printer to size it according to your scale.
Okay, so now what kind of printer are we talking about?
I have a Canon TS5000. It's a flatbed all-in-one that does scanning and everything else. I think it cost, oh, I want to say $75.
Okay.
So you don't have to have anything fancy. I had for quite some time a laser printer because I thought that would give me better resolution. But in fact, the laser tends to burn the paper and make the pigments a little bit darker than I think they should be. So I went back to an inkjet printer. And again, you can adjust the resolution on your printer. So don't tell it to just print normally, tell it to print high quality, as high quality as your printer will print. And it'll print out in cardstock. I use 110-pound cardstock for O scale. I would use probably 110 for S scale. If I'm doing it in HO, for example, or N or anything smaller, I would use probably 65-pound cardstock. And those things are available just about anywhere, but you can go to paper manufacturers and you can get, say, 80-pound cardstock, for example, and things like that. I have a model that I'm about to build of a grocery store that was in the area of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I find that the drawings require me to use 8.5 by 11, or excuse me, 8.5 by 15 rather than 8.5 by 11. And so the 8.5 by 15 cardstock comes in 80-pound. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of adjusting for 80-pound because it's a little bit flimsier than, say, 110-pound.
What about N scale? What poundage?
N scale, I would use 65. Anything thinner than 65, it's not easy to manipulate with. I went to a Sunshine Region meeting, I guess it must have been about 4 or 5 years ago, and a fellow came up to me and he said, I've done some cardstock models, I want you to judge them. And he said, okay. I said, okay, where are they? And he said, right here. and he had 4 Z-scale cardstock models in his hand. And they were incredibly well done. I've never tried Z-scale. I've gone down as far as N, but never Z. But it can be done in Z-scale as well.
So I've got a question for you. When you're talking about these pound ratings with cardstock, what does that actually mean? Pretend
Well,
I don't know anything. And to be frank, when it comes to cardstock, I don't know anything.
here's a piece of 110-pound cardstock. And the way you can tell its poundage is just by holding it at one edge. This is 110. And so it's essentially tensile strength. 65-pound cardstock, if I held it at one edge, it would bend down a little bit further because it's a little bit thinner. But you get bright or ultra bright if you can get it. And this is 110-pound cardstock, and it's plenty thick. People ask me if you have to put some kind of a frame behind it. I know a lot of people who build it on, say, foam core or something like that, or foam board. I've never done that. I've built it straight, and you can build sort of like I guess sort of like egg crates inside the structure to give it lateral integrity. But usually if you have a couple of layers of cardstock, it's solid. This is 2 layers of cardstock here. And you can see it's pretty solid. It's not bending, it's not folding or anything else. That's just 2 layers of cardstock. So it's pretty strong. And then you can build sort of a frame inside, or here's a frame in the inside here, to give it some lateral integrity. Cardstock is nothing more than paper, just thick paper. And I had one fellow ask me, well, why don't you just model out of wood? And I said, this is wood.
Yeah.
It's just ground pulp. It's wood pulp repressed as card. And so if you think about a business card's usually made out of about 110-pound cardstock. But that's just the tensile strength. It's how much it bends if you hold it at one edge. So 65-pound will bend a little bit more, but it's still pretty solid. And I've built lots of structures in HO, and they come out just fine.
You're talking about layering. What do you use to glue it?
The adhesive. That's a good question. That's another thing I should mention as well. I use plain old medium viscosity CA for the most part, and I'm afraid I'm a bit of a cheapo when it comes to that too. I use just Gorilla medium viscosity CA, super glue if you will. I do use some Loctite really thin stuff, because if I put in a layering thing here, I use the lower viscosity so it flows down in between the layers. But for the most part, I use medium viscosity CA. Now I have discovered another glue which is manufactured in Britain. It's called Rocket Card Glue, R-O-K-E-T, card glue, and it's designed specifically for British card modelers. And it dries just about, sometimes faster than CA. So you have to be pretty careful with it, because you cannot tear it apart. But it's good for big surfaces because it's a little bit less viscosity, say, than a medium viscosity glue, a CA glue. The other thing that you have to learn to do that you don't have to do with other models per se is that, of course, once you cut a model or cut a piece of cardstock, this edge, even though it may be printed and it'd be a beautiful structure here, this edge is white. And so you have to color it so that there is no white edge exposed when the structure is built. You want that corner not to be 2 white pieces coming together. So you have to paint that edge. And you can do it a number of different ways. I use artist's pens, Copic pens. I get them through Dick Blick's. I use a T4, which is a gray, and I've forgotten what the number is for the brown. The brown is great if you're using a steel kind of siding or something like that, because if you hold it just against the edge long enough, it will actually move into the cardstock a little bit and give it a little bit of a rusty appearance, for example. You can use watercolor markers. The other thing that I use is just acrylic paints. The old craft acrylic paints that you can get at Michael's or any place like that. I have my own preferences for various colors, but the one that I have found that I use the most is a color called Mudstone. It's done by Delta Ceramcoat, is the manufacturer. And Mudstone is sort of a grayish brown. And so it works really well on a lot of different edges to give it a little bit of shading and make the edges not noticeable. So I use Mudstone quite a bit as well. But for this Adobe, for example, I'm using a brown color from Americana that's called Sable. And it seems to work quite well for my Adobe.
How do you paint the edges?
I get a number 2 fine brush, and I paint the structure from the back side. That is, I lay I dip the brush into my paint, and then I run my brush along the side like this. Rather than trying to use the tip or anything like that, I use the side of the brush, and it does a very good job of not slopping over on the side that you don't want to be seen. For example, here's this thing. It is painted brown along this edge. If you look on the back side, you can see I was sloppy. There were some marks here where I slopped and things like that. But eventually nobody's going to see that part of this structure. And so I paint from the back side so that if I make a brush stroke or a misstroke, it's on the inside, it's not going to be seen. So I use a number 2 round brush, so it comes to a fine point. And then I use just a little bit of water. I wet the brush first and then dip it into the craft paint, and it will not flow. And one of the things that's nice about it is that it seals the edge. And if you use water-based scenery, you want to have that thing sealed. Otherwise, the water wicks up and separates the dye. You don't want that to happen. And so there are a couple of things to do that to prevent that. First of all, seal it with a nice acrylic paint. But then what I do on the bottom of my structures is I take some chapstick. It's paraffin. And I just coat the bottom of my structure with chapstick so that I can use a water-based scenery and it doesn't go through that paraffin barrier. And then I can go right up to the edge of it and use the good old water-based scenery techniques.
Now that's clever.
Well, going back to glue again. What about white glue? I like to use white glue on, cardstock. But,
I haven't had a lot of success with white glue, and maybe you have a technique that I don't. But to me, the problem with white glue is that it's water-based.
Right.
And very often it tends to cause the dyes to separate if you put a little bit too much on.
Yeah.
And so
I did find these little tiny bottles with like needle type things, and then I dilute the glue just a little bit so you could just put a real fine line. And that seems to work. I have tried CA, but I can never seem to get a position quick enough and it dries.
That's probably a good point. You have to be careful with the CA as well.
Right.
But I've not had a problem with CA. I tend to use a toothpick, put some CA out on a glob on a piece of plastic or scrap plastic, and just use my toothpick to go against the edges and things like that. And this door, for example, on this house has 4 hinges on it. Those hinges are individually applied using CA on the piece of the printed cardboard or cardstock. Yeah. So you can get down to pretty small detail, and it's that layering that gives it that texture.
Exactly. Yep. That's what I found. The more layers, the better it looks.
Absolutely right. Absolutely. And that's one of the skills that you have to learn, is to accept the fact that you're going to have a structure that's going to take as long as a craftsman kit, not perhaps in all of the manipulating of the wood and things like that, but in the layering process. One of the models that I test built for Clever Models is an overhead crane, and it has a block and tackle on it, and I think it's 32 or 34 layers of cardstock to get a good size O-scale block and tackle. It's about that size.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it takes skill and patience, just like everything else.
I've been working with some card stock and doing stuff on Cricut. I don't know if you're familiar with the Cricut
Yes.
machine.
Yes, I am.
And that's worked really well for me to cut the initial things out. They won't do real tiny detail,
Right.
but for the most part, you can do your initial layers and doors and overlays and stuff like that. It works pretty good.
Yeah, I've had mixed results with Cricut, and I discovered that a number 11 blade and a steel straight edge cuts just about as fast as me going in there and trying to get it to do it right. So
right, yeah.
So I just buy stock in who is it, Excel, that makes the number 11 blades. I buy them by the 100. My rule of thumb on building a model out of cardstock is at least 1 or 2 number 11 blades per side of the structure. And on the engine house at Gore, for example, I think I totaled up about 60 blades before I built it. There is nothing that will dull a blade faster than paper.
Exactly.
And so I use a lot of blades and just accept the fact that I buy them by the hundreds, and I usually have a couple boxes of 100 available. This structure so far, which is quite small, at least in O scale, is I think I've already used eight blades, so that I've cut it in the manner that I want to cut it. So
how do you determine like when the blade's dull? I mean, if it just doesn't give you
actually it's pretty easy.
Anymore?
Yeah, it's pretty easy. I use the rule that you should have 2 cuts. An initial cut, which you could call a scoring cut, and the second cut should go all the way through without much pressure. Once you have to start putting pressure to cut through cardstock, the blade's too dull.
Right, that's a good rule.
So as long as you cut through in 2 strokes, you're good, and 2 fairly good strokes without much pressure. And you really know you're gone too far when you run it along the straight edge and it moves or dances away from the straight edge. Then you're in trouble.
Right.
That one is long overdue for being replaced.
So we got some questions that are coming up in the chat, and
sure.
I just want to. So Craig Bissinger, if I'm butchering his last name,
Craig, I know Craig.
If I'm butchering your last name, I apologize. But he asks, when constructing a cardstock model, do you recommend layering things like the windows when the parts are flat before doing, the major assembly?
Absolutely.
And of course, do you have any other tips on how to approach the assembly?
Yeah, I cut out each side, and on each side, for example, here, I put the door in, I inset the door, I put on the various pieces like the step and the frames around the windows and things like that ahead of time. And then when you assemble it, I don't know, it's a sense of accomplishment. It makes you feel better about it, but it is easier when each side is laid flat to do all the window work, glaze the windows if you want to glaze the windows and things like that. If you want to put in the interior, you have to plan that a little bit ahead of time. But usually, yeah, I do all of the work when it's flat. And so you may spend per side, if you've got several windows, you may spend 3 or 4 days of evenings, maybe a couple hours per evening, layering the windows, putting the windows in, glazing them, doing that. I use, in no scale, I use men's shirt pins for doorknobs, for example. And I put in the doorknobs on the doors and things like that long before I ever assemble the sides. And so then I can use either the, they call them gluing tabs that the kit manufacturers come with, or if you don't like those gluing tabs, I get some, scale, say 6x6, at least an O scale or something like that, to make my corners. Or I can use just cardstock and cut a strip and score it down the middle to make a 90-degree angle to make my corners, to attach my two corners together. So yeah, you got to do the windows and everything else, or I would recommend doing the windows and everything else first.
When you build your building,
Mm-hmm.
and you've got the front of the building in one side, does the front of your building extend the full way and your side butt up against it, or do you do it the other way and have the front butt up against the side?
Actually, they come to a corner. I mean, they come to a corner, which is why both of those white edges have to be painted. And so I don't have one here, but in general, what you wind up doing, if this is a piece of cardstock, and say it were, even if it were just a strip, you essentially put one side of your cardstock against this strip here, one side of your cardstock against this strip here, and they butt up against each other. And so that's why you have to have that white, because usually if it's a wooden structure, for example, you've usually got some kind of a corner piece anyway that's going to cover up that open joint.
Right.
So it doesn't really matter too much, but the pieces are designed so that they literally butt up or come up against each other.
So one edge against the other edge.
Correct.
All right, so here's another question out of the chat real quick.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Tusick, and again, if I'm butchering the last name, Charlie, I apologize. I'm not going to claim I'm perfect. Can you cover working with window material, what type of material, the glue, and how do you add the interior details behind the window?
Well, okay, for the window material, I use glass, microscope cover glass. Now you can get it from, I guess it's Clover House. You can get it. And actually Carolina Biological will send you you can buy 8.5 by 11 sheets of it. And you use a diamond blade to cut it, or a diamond cutter to cut it. And it takes a little bit of skill to learn how to do that. But I think as far as glass goes, nothing looks better than glass. And once my frames are built and I want to glaze it with the glass, I use another material. I use PSA, pressure sensitive adhesive. Some people call it canopy glue, but what it is it's essentially a white acrylic glue that once it's dry, it remains very sticky. It's much stickier than, say, Aleene's tacky glue, for example. It's much stickier than that. You get PSE from Micromark, and a bottle will last you forever. And you coat the back of your frame with the tacky glue, or the either it's canopy glue or PSA, and you wait for it to dry. It takes about 5 minutes for it to dry. It's clear then, and you can put that piece of glass, or you could use, say, 1500s clear styrene, and which most people find a little bit easier to work with. And you put those, you put that down. You're not going to get any glue leakage because it's dry. It's dry but sticky, and it'll stay on there at least for 20 years, and at least as old as some of my models are, and and it'll stick there forever. As far as interiors go, once I've got the walls up, I have to think ahead of time about where I want to put the interior walls. Clever Models, for example, sells about a dozen different textures that are just walls with wainscoting and other kinds of wallpaper and things like that. You set those up as your interior walls. You can see through the window and you can see those interior walls. So particularly if it's lit. And then the material or the interior details are the same old interior details that you buy from any detail manufacturer. In my case, I get a lot of them from Berkshire Valley. I get quite a few of them from Grant Line and a number of other places. And oh gosh, what's his name? He's in Tennessee. He's in Paris, Tennessee. Can't think of his name. At any rate, there are about 4 or 5 different manufacturers of those materials, and you paint them and everything else just as if you were detailing any other kind of a model. Place them closely inside, put your figures inside if you want figures inside, and then maybe cut a small hole in for an LED light and go on just as if you were building any other kind of a structure. The only thing that I would warn you against is if you're going to light a structure, light the interior of a structure, make sure you've got at least 2 layers of cardstock on your walls. Otherwise, the light will tend to bleed through. It will bleed through 1 layer, but I've never seen it bleed through 2 layers.
All right. So Craig has another question that he posted in chat. It says here, back at David Ferrari's.
Dave Ferrari, yep.
Okay. Back at Dave Ferrari's day, they used Strathmore board, a thicker and softer paper board, and did a lot of embossing with styluses and other tools to improve the appearance. Have you ever tried doing something like that?
I have, back in the day when there were Strathmore kits, as a matter of fact. I tried that. I used to read Model Railroader back then and tried that. I think at the time, the Sidam models, for example, were Strathmore or a thick cardboard. I never had much luck with it, but I know people who do that. A couple of layers of cardstock and you can emboss that cardstock just as well. And to me, the Strathmore is more expensive. I built a few structures out of Strathmore. Cardstock, a couple layers of cardstock, glue them together, and you can emboss those as well. I've tried it. I've not been very good at it, so maybe it's one of those skills I yet need to do.
All righty.
Dylan, this is Phil. I actually had a secondary question out of that, which was, that seems to be an ideal application for that cry cut. Being able, instead of having it do the cuts that are really good, but being able to take something and use it as an embosser to auto emboss a pattern where if there's a little waviness, just curious if that would sound interesting as a thought process.
That's an interesting idea. I haven't quite gotten to that point yet to abandon the number 11 blade for a cry cut or a cricket or whatever you want to call it. So
yeah, I understand the cutting on the outside. Just this interesting thing about if you could take something and kind of build up the kit without the walls or the model without the walls final cut with the overlays, then put it in the cry cut after it's layered and have it go through and emboss on those layers. And now you can get layered detail on the outside by using cry cut. I don't know if it's possible. I'm not a cry cut person, so.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of coding to me that I don't want to do.
I think with the Cricut, it is possible. I've had one for a long time. Haven't used it in a long time. But I remember seeing when I was looking for the deep cut blade that I got for it, that they do have an embossing tool. Now, I have no clue how you would even set it up to do that embossing pattern.
Yeah, I don't.
But in theory,
I haven't done anything on the embossing tool with Cricut, but I found that deep cut blade sometimes ends up, if you cut too thick a material, gets stuck in the material, and then it just ruins the cut because it pulls up, the blade comes out when the head comes up, and then it just drags it. So.
Well, I borrowed one from a neighbor's wife who was using it to make scrapbooks, doing scrapbooking. and I just fooled around with it and decided I could do better with my number 11 blade. So I must admit my experience is limited.
The Cricut has its limits. I agree. I bought it mainly to do that, and then I ended up doing a lot of other crafty stuff with it as well.
I hate to be the only one that doesn't have any idea what you guys are talking about. What is a Cricut?
It's an automated cutting tool on it. It's essentially a table with an automated cutting tool on it. It's about the size of a regular computer printer.
Exactly.
And you can put your paper in there and tell it to cut the paper in a certain pattern, like a flower or something like that, and it cuts the paper like a flower. So it's just a cutting tool. It's an automatic cutting tool, but you have to program it. And there are several of them, but there's several different versions of it. But the Cricut is the only one I've ever tried.
Yeah, Brothers also makes one.
Oh yeah.
I think you made the magic statement of computer programming. That's probably why I've never heard of it.
Well, people who know me think that I'm ancient anyway, because even up until, I retired 2 years ago, I still use Fortran because I think it's a better language than anyone I've seen since. And I learned Fortran in 1966. So.
I can write Fortran in 6 different languages.
Good for you.
It's fairly easy to use those machines, though, because you can just use your text editor, just cutting and pasting your text and so on to, and it's just like an art program. You can draw your lines and everything else. I've been using a few times Cameo, which is the same thing, and got some really intricate small lettered neon signs using some of the electric sign kits and so on. I just wanted to say, Jim, I've been using the Clever Models kits for a few years. I first got into it with the textures with the Insul brick because they made a good Insul brick. And after that, they're open to suggestions for doing other things. They did a black tar paper. I said, well, why don't you do a red-brown tar paper and a green tar paper? So they came out with those things too. And download those and print them to your heart's content. So yeah, they're good things to use anyway.
I actually bought all the their whole texture program. I got both discs, which is pretty good. There's a lot of nice textures in there.
I like their windows, and they've at various times been very kind to me and designed some special windows and things like that. One of my big projects that this Adobe is the first part of is to recreate Tom York's Pepito's Pintos factory. And the factory is about, I believe it's 54 feet long in O scale. So it's going to be about that size. And I'm going to try to build it out of cardstock. So we'll see what's going to happen. But they have very special windows. It looks almost like a Cuban cigar factory. So I'm interested that they made some windows for me. So I'm interested to give them a shot.
Have you ever used Evan's design product?
I have.
And how do you compare that to using the stuff from Clever Models?
Well,
I understand they're different, but
yeah, they're very different because in Evan's designs, you can essentially design the entire structure and superimpose the whatever their textures are on it, or do what I've done, which is to print out a Clever Models structure on the paper and then run my building design through on that already printed structure. So I think it's usable. I like their advertiser software better because it makes a lot of neat signs, and I use that a lot more. But
I found that I found their software to be a little bit clunky, Evans Design, but I do have their window treatment and their sign, and that works pretty good. I mean, you know.
Yep, the signs work well. I've used their window treatments as well. And in most cases, when I want to scratch build something, I really don't think of it in terms of designing it on a computer. I make a sketch of it, and just to give myself the rough dimensions, and then I sort of freewheel it anyway. So.
Okay. Have you ever had your material judged? You know, I know you're already an MMR and it doesn't all matter, but
well, let me tell you,
how well is it responded to by judges?
Let me tell you a thing. I have an interesting story about that. I had yet one structure to go for my AP certificate for structures, and two master model railroaders, both of them deceased now, but Dennis Little and Jim Beatty came to my house, and they were judging my scenery as well, which was not a problem. And they said, well, what's your 10th structure or whatever, 12th structure? And I said, here it is. It's this cardstock engine house. And they said, we can't judge it. And I said, why not? And they said, because it's cardstock. We don't know how to judge cardstock. And I said, oh. And they said, we're just not going to judge it. You'll have to build something else out of something we're familiar with, like sheet plastic or wood or something like that. And so over the next couple of months, I built something else. I don't even remember what it was, out of regular old wood, and passed it. And they gave me the structures certificate, and I got my master model railroader maybe 6 months later. But if you read the NMRA magazine, 2 months ago, I had an article on a little diorama that I built, actually to display a Monson 2-foot gauge snowplow. And so when I did it, when I filled out the judging form, I said, I just wrote to the judges, it's up to you to decide whether or not these are basic shapes and forms. To me, a texture printed on computer is no different than if I went and bought already cut clapboard siding, for example, or board and batten siding. As a matter of fact, my board and batten is actually 2 pieces because I put down all the battens individually. And I said, I'll leave it up to you. And the model or the diorama scored 112 points. So I figured, okay, then at least they've gotten around to the fact, at least those 2 judges did, that maybe it's considered to be a basic form, and no different than, say, buying already printed clapboard siding or something like that, V-groove siding, something like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Jim, what was the name of the company that you buy your glass from?
Clover House.
Thank you.
They're in San Francisco, I believe.
Jim, for a new modeler that is trying to learn how to build structures, would you recommend he start in card, because it would be the cheapest way for him to get into doing model building, and he wouldn't need to have a bunch of tools to do it, or a bunch of different kind of glues, and he wouldn't have to spend a lot of money on the front end, and he can spend all the money he wants to on the detailed parts later. But if he makes a mistake on it, correcting the mistake is printing another piece of paper.
That's correct. Yeah, I think it's not a bad way to start. And as a matter of fact, if you buy Clever Models kits now, they actually produce a 3-dimensional assembly diagram, usually 2 or 3 with each kit, that shows you what it looks like from each side and where the pieces are expected to go. Plus, Dave Michnikovsky now also has a page or 2 of instructions that comes with the kit. So it's actually a lot easier than it was in the old days, where they just sent you the parts and said, good luck. So I always likened it to getting a fine scale miniatures kit and opening the box, and there's a sign inside that says "Have fun." So it's you know, there are at least a little bit more thought to getting the instructions to a novice. So
They also offer some free kits on their site, don't they?
they do indeed. If you go to clevermodels.net, not .com, clevermodels.net, they have a tab that's called freebies. And they have a couple of kits that they've had forever there. There's a really nice interlocking switch tower that's been there for decades. Usually, though, they put up a freebie and it's up there for a month or so. And you can download it immediately and start building right away, print it out on your own cardstock, and away you go. They do sell all of their kits online. You can order it. They'll email you essentially the files. You keep them forever. And then they also have collections of structures and collections of rolling stock on thumb drive. They used to be on discs, now it's on thumb drive, and you can order that and they send you the thumb drive in the mail. So the freebies they have, their most recent freebie is, well, I think it's a yard office made like a double wide, as I recall. It's sort of like a double wide yard office, or a construction office or something like that. A little too modern for me. I model 1951, so a little too modern for me.
I know when I got all the textures from Clever, I just they just sent me an email link and I got them that way rather than the thumb drive.
Right.
And it was basically the same thing. You put them on your computer, you save them forever. You can transfer them to a thumb drive if you want, you know.
Yep.
But
I keep most of mine both on the computer and on a thumb drive.
Exactly.
I've had enough hard drives crash that I keep a backup.
Sometimes twice.
Exactly. Yep.
What's the hardest kit you've built?
It was another test build, and actually sometime in the future I'm going to talk about it. The coaling tower at Chama, New Mexico. I built it as a test build for them, and after I got done with it, I wrote them a letter and I said, nobody will do this. It was an incredibly difficult kit to put together. Again, I had no instructions. Maybe they could come up with some instructions. But if you know the coaling tower at Chama, New Mexico, it's an outside framed structure. And so you have to take cardstock to make each one of those timbers. Let's say 4x4 or 6x6 timbers or 8x8 timbers. And so you got to do some really fine edge painting and some really fine gluing to get those timbers to go right. That's probably the most complex. I think the engine house at Gore is probably the second most complex. I've got a big brewery that I put together, but that was reasonably easy that I put together. It's about, oh, maybe 3 times the size of this, and it's 2 stories high, and it's a brewery on my layout. They make Buzzard Belch beer, so.
You tried to make any freight cars?
I have, yes. I've made a few. They do have, Clever Models does have a few kits for ON30 and HON3, I think. But at any rate, they do have some models. And I have built a couple of myself just out of curiosity. And unfortunately, because I just moved and my layout room is not going to be available for a year yet, I haven't unpacked any of my rolling stock. Otherwise, I would have had it to show you. But in the article in Model Railroader, it'll show you the snowplow. Not Model Railroader, excuse me, the NMRA magazine. It'll show you the snowplow that I built.
Right.
And so, yeah, I've made rolling stock out of it. I've not made an engine yet. I don't think I'm going to do that. I've got an engine kit in front of me that may take me forever to build. So I finally broke down and bought a Garrett, and it came in a million pieces, and it may stay that way for quite some time.
Well, a Garrett for your first locomotive is probably not the smartest thing to do either.
Well, I've scratch built locomotives before, but not a Garrett. So
wait, a Garrett. So like, what are we talking about? A backwoods miniatures kit here?
Exactly. The 262 plus 262.
Oh, the NGG16.
Yep.
Beast.
Yep. It's a beast. I needed at least one beast on my layout, and even though it's a British prototype, I lived in South Africa for a few years, and right at the end of the Garrett's careers, and I loved them. I would go anywhere to see a Garrett operate, and so I figured, even though I'm modeling northern New Mexico, somehow my railroad is going to have a Garrett.
Well, it's your railroad as long as you're happy with it. And besides,
there you go.
Besides, I hear there's one down in Texas.
That's what I hear too.
What was it? Some of the guys from the WWF were talking one day. They're like, "Oh, wouldn't that be cool?" And then somebody kind of looked at them and just went, "You do realize that we'd probably crush every bridge on this line with that, right?"
Well, if it's a small one, 240 plus 240 or something like that.
I mean, maybe something like K1 would work there, but
maybe.
The NGG16s, those are heavyweights.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Those would crush a main 2-foot gauge bridge.
In South Africa, they pulled coal, lots of coal. So
coal, concrete, they did everything.
Yep, yep.
Jim, do you weather your buildings?
I do. About 80% of it is of course part of the texture done by the CAD designer, but I also weather with pan pastels, and I've found pan pastels to do remarkably well on just about anything. It takes a little bit of finesse because you don't have the texture necessarily to grab the pastel, but I've used pan pastels with quite good success.
How do you seal your model after you're finished with it?
Actually, I don't seal it afterwards. I seal it beforehand. That's a good, thank you for reminding me too. When I get these kits and I print out a piece of cardstock with the pieces all laid out, I spray it then with a, used to be dull coat, but now the dull coat isn't all that good. So I use Krylon matte a Krylon matte spray, and I seal it before I ever start working with it. The sealant really does a marvelous job at blocking UV, and UV will fade the dyes eventually. And so I've had these structures on my layout for 15, 16 years and haven't seen any fading at all. And I was living in Florida, so I haven't had any warping either. So it's good material.
So do you do both sides or just one side?
Both sides. It also helps prevent the bleeding of the dyes if you get water or alcohol. Don't get close to it with alcohol. That separates the dyes really fast.
I came in a little late. How do you brace the buildings?
Actually, I don't, unless it's a very long side, longer than say about 10 inches. If it goes over 10 inches, I'll brace it with, oh gosh, I used to have a student who worked at Starbucks, and she brought me about 3 boxes of stir sticks. And so I think I'm still on my first box of stir sticks that I just used to brace it with. But most of the time, I just cut out a footprint out of cardstock, a footprint of the building out of cardstock, and then I put glue tabs around the 4 corners, and I'll put like 3 or 4 of them nested inside the structure. That gives it enough lateral stability. And if you have 3 or 4 layers of window material and things like that, roofing materials, it's amazingly stable structure.
after like you're like laminating like with plywood, it winds up being almost like plywood when you're done.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And if you've ever lifted a 1/2-inch plywood, you know it's pretty stable and heavy.
So what you're really saying, the bottom line of this, to me at least, is from a financial standpoint, you can spend $30 or you can spend $400. You can build the same quality product at the end of the day. It's probably going to take you just as long to do it. What you're really talking about is you don't need as many tools. You don't need as much expertise perhaps to start, and you're going to save a lot of money.
Well, I agree, particularly with the basic kits, which are not much more than putting a box together, and then adding layers to make windows and things like that. Probably not. I use them for background structures. I use them for foreground structures. On my old layout, I had a sign up that said,
"Wow, I guess somebody had a motorcycle driving by."
I guess so. I used to say that I have 18 structures on the layout that are made of cardstock. Can you find all of them?
Who's doing that? Oh, hold on, there we go. I just figured out who was. I think he might be working in the background.
Okay, and most people got to about 10, and so I figure that's pretty good if they can't tell that the structure is made out of cardstock. And so I think what makes it a really good structure is the detail that you put around it to convince people that it's a more complex build than perhaps you know it is. But a lot of people look at the layering and think it appears three-dimensional, so it must be, and it is. And you can cut individual clapboards and make cardstock clapboards if you want to. So.
Anybody have any other questions for Jim?
Well, I see a question there about what won't I model in paper?
Airplanes.
Oh no, I've got airplanes. You know, I see the thing about gutters and things like that. I don't have the model down here, but gutters are easy to make in paper. I don't know. I can't think of anything that is difficult. Dimensional lumber would be. If I had to make an O-scale 2x4 out of cardstock, I don't think I'd do that. I'd probably get some dimensional lumber and say, here it is, rather than trying to make it. But I don't think there's anything that I haven't built that's difficult. Stairs can be a little bit of a challenge. Sometimes making smokestacks can be a bit of a challenge because you've got to create a tube out of cardstock. And that can be a bit of a challenge. And very often I just use a soda straw and take the cardstock to make the cap, for example. So I just figure one way or another, I'm going to figure out how to do this. So I haven't found anything too challenging. The most challenging thing that I hadn't thought about at all was, like I said, making Adobe. And after fooling around with these textures for the last 3 or 4 weeks, I think I might get close. So we'll see.
Hey, Jim. I have an oddball rabbit hole question about World War II history.
Uh-oh.
Now,
yes,
your dad worked at Los Alamos.
Correct.
On the Manhattan Project.
Correct. So did my mother.
Okay. Now, did he go to college, graduate, interview like GE and IBM and all the companies and get hired to the Manhattan Project?
No.
Or was he?
I will tell this story. It's not a long story, but my father went to Penn State.
Yep.
It was Penn State College then. And he was working on an advanced degree, a master's degree, and he developed a technique to alloy nickel and uranium. And he didn't see any practical purpose for it at all, but that was what his master's project was. And he tells this story. I don't know how true it is or not, but he had tried to get into the Army and couldn't get in because he was flat-footed.
Yep.
And he said that a couple of guys approached him the day after graduation and said, "We'd like you to work for us as a project going on that's going to change the war, and we want your expertise." And he said, "Well, what am I going to do?" And they said, "We can't tell you, but we'll pay you." I think they were offering him $9,000 or $10,000 a year. And he said, "If you're not going to tell me, you guys are crazy. I'm going back home." And he went to work for Sylvania in the little town in Pennsylvania where he worked. He worked there a week and he got a draft notice. And he thought that was unusual. He got a draft notice. He went to boot camp or to get into Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. They took him aside, gave him a tech sergeant's uniform, put him on a train. He got off the train in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They put him on a bus and sent him up to Los Alamos, and he did exactly the same job for $82 a month.
Wow. Now, at the time, the people working on the Manhattan Project could not get draft deferments because they couldn't tell their draft board what they were doing.
That's right.
So they would kidnap them. They would disappear.
Right.
Okay.
That's right.
And I was wondering if your dad was one of those who was kidnapped, but he was
in a sense.
Yeah. So he was kind of hijacked through the Army.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
my mother was a theoretical mathematician, and her brother had already been hijacked.
Okay.
And told my mother that it was a wonderful opportunity for her if she wanted to go to New Mexico. I'm not sure my mother even heard of New Mexico, but, but she went voluntarily.
Okay. Well, sometime when this whole thing is over, I can tell you my story because it somehow follows the same line as your dad. And because that program is being run well into the 50s and 60s.
Oh, I'm sure of that.
Yeah,
I'm sure of that. My draft board was straight up with me. They just said, "You're going to Vietnam." So that was it.
Well, my son is a very gifted mathematician. And by the way, the program that your dad ran into was paid for by a slush fund out of the Air Force or the Army Air Corps called Majestic. And you may have heard the term Majestic as applying to flying saucers and aliens and things like that.
Yes,
well,
indeed.
Majestic was a catch-all program. Like if you're in the Air Force and you had a radar station and they told you to put it on the side of a hill, well, the radar station is a trailer and you put it on the side of the hill. You need a foundation, you need a set of stairs, you know,
of course.
you need about $1,000 worth of wood and concrete blocks, and Majestic paid for that so that it would slide through the Air Force. Well, that whole program was paid for by Majestics. And when I was a kid growing up, the FBI would come out looking to kidnap smart kids in crummy neighborhoods. And my son went to a place at Sandia Laboratories, which had a mathematics contest. And he did phenomenally well in mathematics. And I turned to one of the gentlemen when he was getting his award in the 3rd grade. When he was getting his award, I turned to one of the guys at the table and I said, "So this is how you recruit mathematicians?" And he says, "Yes." And I said, "This is a whole lot easier than Majestic, isn't it?" And he says, "You're not supposed to know about that."
All right. Everybody knew about that.
Yeah. But yeah, I bumped up against that when I was a kid in high school. Like your dad, I was kind of an amateur metallurgist, and I found a method of using gallium and nickel to form an amalgam, and that got somebody's interest. And I was doing it with a totally different application, but they wanted to talk to me.
Oh yeah, I know.
My dad had a machine shop, and he was incredibly good with non-ferrous alloys. Most machinists and tool and die makers know how to do steel and maybe aluminum, but you get into brass, you get into gallium, you get into nickel, you get into titanium. They have no idea how to make the tools.
Yep.
So, but anyway, that's interesting. Okay. We'll talk sometime.
Okay.
When this ends. In fact, I'll be up in New Hampshire because I'll be coming back for Boston Rail Run if and when they ever do it.
If they ever do it, yeah.
Are you interested in doing Boston Rail Run on operating?
We'll see.
Oh, okay.
I know about it. We'll
Oh,
see.
yeah. So you already know about it. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, well, this is fun. I love the cardstock method. I think it is awesome.
Well,
so,
thank you. It's great.
Yeah.
Jim, I wonder if we could change the subject a little bit. How do you feel about the current state of model building? Do you think that it's dying? Do you think that it needs help? I mean, how do you feel it's going to survive, and that we're going to continue building on the skills that have gotten us this far?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I sort of think of model railroading in general, or modeling in general, as being sort of steady state. It seems like everybody goes through the phase of getting interested in modeling one level or another when they're kids. Then they drop out and go chase women in fast cars and things like that for a while, and then they get back into it, but they haven't got a lot of commitment to it because they got families to raise and things like that. And then it's about the time they're to about 50 or so that they get into it, and there's a turnover. And I think people sort of think of model railroading as being a dying hobby because it's, you know, staffed mostly by old people, but I don't think so. I think that I go to enough train shows and I see a lot of young people there who are really interested in the hobby, and I know that I may not ever see them again because they're going to go through that phase of forming a career, forming a family, and then they'll get back into it again. And I think it's a relatively continuous operation. I think we're living in a time for model building that's really fantastic. I've never seen so much stuff available, particularly in O scale. And in an HO, it's just unbelievable. I was modeling HO for a lot of years, but I was sort of reluctant to look at ON30, but it intrigued me too much, and I don't have problems finding anything. So.
Well, also they're going with the 3D printing and Adrenos and all this type of stuff. So it's going in multiple directions other than just a model train. Like,
well, I agree, but I think that goes
all part of
benefit us all. Yeah. I don't think I'll ever design anything in 3D myself, but I'll certainly purchase stuff designed in 3D. So.
Where is there a good place to get like 1800s stuff?
1800s stuff? Well, there are.
It's sort of like right after the Civil War.
Yeah. Well, you mean as far as structures go?
Yes.
There are probably about maybe half a dozen or so cardstock structures that are false front. And you can make those false front structures be just about anything you want. If you want colonial type houses and things like that, that might be a little bit tougher. Although something like good old Sue's structure here is, you know, it's pretty generic. It could have been built anytime since 1800. So it's a matter of looking at a structure and seeing beyond what the kit is sometimes. But I think as far as 1850 to 1900, at least in O scale, I go with Roger Malinowski's kits, which is Stony Creek Designs. He has a lot of really great false front stuff, and they're if you're going to buy one, it's like buying a fine scale miniatures kit. They're not cheap, but boy, they make beautiful, beautiful kits, buildings when they're done. And I've got a whole slew of them on my layout too.
Jim.
Hi, Lex.
How are you?
Good.
It's a pleasure being on tonight. Thank you, Jim. I've had one experience with paper in modeling. A friend of mine was modeling in ON30, wanted the Argo mill.
Mm.
He only had 7 inches to put it in.
Oh, well, okay.
So what I did is I had a number of photographs for my visit, and I used a lot of internet photographs.
Mm-hmm.
And using Photoshop, I created all the walls,
mm-hmm.
and then sectioned it in shallow layers. Right. The prime view was at the front, and basically, that's what it came up like.
That looks gorgeous. Looks great.
Now the windows are all been photoshopped. He didn't glaze them,
mm-hmm.
Including the roof and so on. So it was kind of an interesting experience for me to tackle, a medium that I had never done before. What was interesting for me was creating the elevations to start with, and having to remove a lot of the overgrown plant material that was there,
right,
and
right.
a lot of debris, and cleaning it up, and then doing a little weathering on it. So I did all the roof sections and the walls, and as you know, it's mostly all corrugated material.
Right.
And he hasn't added any 3D dimension to it, unfortunately. But it was pretty amazing taking a photograph of an actual building and with a little editing and printing it, how realistic this came up.
Yeah, I agree.
In 7 inches, that was just part of it right there. And then there's the bins up at the top that were very shallow. And so that was my only experience in paper, and I found it really quite a challenge, and very rewarding, actually, because the results were better than I had expected.
Yeah, that's something that I enjoy about it too, is sort of the working out the puzzle kind of an exercise. I've always enjoyed that. So yeah, well, that's a beautiful model. That's a great model. So
yeah, it really did turn out well in his layout. He hasn't quite finished the back cribbing and timbers and the bins and anything yet. That's his job. I did the hard part.
It is. Well, yeah, working with Photoshop, or I use GIMP, but it does the same thing.
Yep.
Is an interesting challenge. Yeah. Yep.
And it's amazing on different views and photographs where he takes the layout, if he gets it just right, how convincing it is that because he's painted a mural background behind it, and with the right angles, you can't tell this. It's only 7 inches deep.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know,
wonderful.
It goes back in long layers, and so it anyway, it was a challenge and very interesting for me.
Good. I'm glad I've got somebody who was interested.
Yeah.
Good.
You got great tips there too. With some of the things I hadn't thought of at assembly, because those corners I had to very carefully laminate the paper over cardstock, to get those mited.
Right.
Although I have to admit, because it was corrugated siding, I could cheat.
Yes.
So I wrapped the end over slightly, and then overlapped the side one. And
that works.
But I still had to, as you mentioned, put a little bit of coloring on the edge of the paper.
Right.
You still would, otherwise would see that white edge.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's one of the things that you do in cardstock modeling that you don't do much anywhere else. Although I usually cut strip wood and realized that the piece that I had painted so well or dyed so well is now wood colored at the end, and I got to go back and figure out how to touch it up and things like that. So this is just a little bit earlier in the process.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind showing a couple kits, if you don't mind, that I did out of cardstock.
Sure.
This would, hopefully you can see it, but this was designed on Cricut and did some layering. The I even did 2x4 stuff in the middle, inside, and
Hold it up a little bit
like
into the camera just because we
A
can't
little
see
bit
it.
higher, a little bit higher.
a little higher.
There we go.
Perfect.
Yeah, because I can't see where it's at. So
It actually, the focus is better if you put your hands behind it. Because the problem is the camera is trying to focus on you in the building. The more you have a
Okay.
solid surface behind the building,
so like that,
even
Yeah.
holding a piece of paper behind it actually makes it better. 'Cause
right?
probably, yeah, good.
But anyway, I did this all on Cricut, designed it, and most of this texture is clever model stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I did 2x6 roof rafters or wood, but I did the bottom as well to give it some structure.
Mm-hmm.
And the doors are 2 layers actually with glass in between to give it that little bit of dimension
And the
look. Well,
thickness.
actually, there are 3 layers. I'm sorry. The 2 solid layers with glass in between it, and then the overlay to make it look like the wood overlay.
Right, looks great.
Thank you.
I like those. I like the use of the wood rafters. I tend to do that myself.
Right. Oh, it's
And-
much easier.
And I've had people say, "Are you allowed to do that?" And I think, I don't think the cardstock police care.
Right. Exactly.
It's a mixed medium. Sorry.
Right. But here's another one that I designed. This is actual bar down the street from me. This happens to be Ewing's Cafe, but as my name. But I did design it all in Cricut. It's on this one was on cardstock or heavy cardstock, and then I put the full label print over it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's a little bit stronger.
Yep.
But the actual windows are just plain acetate, and I run that to get all the printing on it through an old Alps printer. If anybody's familiar with that.
Oh yeah, I wish I had one.
Right. Well, mine's almost dead, believe me. I got tons of ink left, but almost dead. And then vinyl around the windows, and so it was a challenge to do. And but I did. I think the doors are actually the side doors were actually from Tishy. I cheated on them, but so that's some stuff I've been playing around with, and
Whatever works, it looks great.
Yeah, thank you.
Looks
but
great.
It's fun, to really come up with a paper building, and I've even downloaded a few off of the internet that are free and played around with them, and sometimes you can spruce them up, sometimes you can't,
Yep.
But it's fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. While we're talking about paper buildings, have you ever tried? I got from Clever Models. He had a disc of critters, I believe it was called.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever built any of them?
I have built one or two of the critters.
What's that?
I have built them.
Are they
I've
pretty
built
good once you build them?
Not too bad. My biggest problem was I was trying to find a good drive for them.
Right. Yeah, that's what I haven't found.
Well, I eventually used the Stanton drives from Northwest Shortline.
Okay.
And used the Stanton drive because you can order those Stanton drives in a bunch of different wheelbases. And so once you figure out what the wheelbase is, and it's DCC, which to me was great.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I've been kind of scared to build them. I printed out one, and I'm like, well, okay, I'll get back to that another time. But
yeah,
really
no, they come out well. They come out well.
You've got some really nice ones in there because I'm doing some ON30 stuff as well. And I think it'd be a nice change to do something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to see how it's yours come out. Mine came out just fine.
Yeah,
I've got a couple of them on my layout, or had a couple of them on my layout. So yeah.
Cool. Well, that's good to know. So I'm gonna tackle that at some point here, and
it's more a matter of learning how to detail things.
Right.
And in some of those critters, you wind up having to add a little bit more detail than is there on the paper, like nut bolt washing kinds of things, or rivets and things like that. And so that becomes a bit of a challenge. When I put rivet strips on, I actually sprayed my the sides with a gloss medium. I think it was a Krylon gloss, as a matter of fact, put on the, oh gosh, what's the company that makes those? Archer? Is it Archer that makes the rivet decals and things like that they're dimensional? And they didn't seem to bother the cardstock at all. So
Are they water slide decals?
mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
But they're just three-dimensional rivets and things, all kinds of interesting things like that. I think it's Archer decals. Yeah.
Hey, Dylan, can you turn on screen share for a moment?
Ah, crud. The screen share's acting up again. And damn it. No, we had an issue yesterday where for some reason the options menu was just not even there. And guess what? It's not even there anymore.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So I can't even turn it on. Go figure. I don't know why. We had this when me, Jim, and James sat down yesterday. We were having the same, or Thursday, we were having the same problem. If James is in here still, I'd say, hey, oh, he is still in here.
So you don't get that little up arrow to the right of share screen?
No, I don't. It's
you
James.
go
You
to advanced settings. Do you want to? Can you make me host or?
Yeah, let me make you host, and then you send it back to me, and that should fix it again. Let me just find you real quick.
Technology is fantastic until it doesn't work.
Well, yeah. So you know what the story is here. This product was built to have easy adoption by small businesses. It was kind of designed to be viral. So you're a salesman, you buy this for $15 a month because it saves you 3-hour drives in the car and keeps your customers happy. And all of a sudden, groups like us were using it. But the real problem was that church groups and school groups started putting up their Facebook page the meeting.
There we go. Menu's back.
And that created all the issues. So.
All right, you should be able to share, Phil.
Cool. Here we go. So I just wanted to show you this. This is a picture of a city, which was actually done and printed. And it's actually printed out. I got the idea at a meet where somebody was talking about using prints from Costco for backdrops. And Costco does a 20 by 60 inch print for $19.95. Now it's a little bright. These have been shot with dull coat, but it's on a club layout where the public viewing is about where we are. So they're really constrained to being about this far away. And these are all just printed out and then mounted on hardboard. And then just mounted to the backdrop. So this is actually, this one here is back up behind and is actually a movie theater. So you actually see it, and you can see this one's actually a box. And you can see the problem a little bit with the glare shine up there. But this was an area that for 20 years had never had a city, and literally in about a week, we built a city. So
wonderful.
So it's kind of the opposite of the detail. But it's the whole point. These technologies and the printing are just amazing. So,
interesting idea.
By the way, for anyone who's interested, those were all produced in PowerPoint, which, like anybody who has an office job or use a computer, you probably have PowerPoint. And PowerPoint, it turns out, is a drawing package masquerading as a slide package. And because you can take any object on PowerPoint, you can scale the size of it. And so actually I got into that originally doing printed interiors for buildings. And so actually at some point, I think Jim, I talked about probably do some sort of a thing on how you do that. It's really simple. You actually copy the kits before you assemble them, and then use that to make templates. And then you can fill that with textures. And clearly, Jim, this is all those textures you bring together. So it's kind of an interesting thought process. A lot of things you can do with a computer.
Yep. Well, I got lots to think about.
Well, you'll have to come back and join us on July the 11th, because Phil is going to be the modeler that's going to be talking about technology for model railroading, and his modeling and what he does. So you'll learn a lot more from him then, Jim.
I'll try to do that.
Simple technology. So the thing that's so interesting is so much of the technology. If you think about all the CAD programs, they're all designed for a level of complexity that's both in 2 dimensions in terms of what you're trying to do, but also they're all designed for 3 dimensions. And what's really interesting about something like PowerPoint is it's a 2-dimensional drawing program that you can use to create any shape. And so once you do that, like scratch building a building, you make a square and that's a wall. Then you want to put a door in, that's another square. And you can change the thickness of the lines. You can do it, and then you can fill that with a texture or put a texture in a place. So it's actually really interesting that it's so kind of co-joined with what you're doing in terms of being able to take it to a different kind of environment and doing more things on your own.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting combination. So.
Well, listen, I'll have to come back and listen on July 11th.
Absolutely. Jim, I can't thank you enough for doing this tonight. I mean, it's really been special. And I do remember the judging. I do remember the Adobe. And I would do it all again.
Excellent.
But thanks so much for being.
By the way, for everyone on here, if you go down to the bottom, you see a little thing called reactions. And if you click on there, you can all clap.
There you go.
And it's just it's a cool tool to show appreciation or a thumbs up. But anytime, it's great. Absolutely, every time you see it's wonderful.
Well, back at you. Thank you. I enjoyed myself.
It's been a great presentation. A lot of good tips that I picked up as well. So
well, I enjoyed it. So.
Well, listen. Let me tell you what's going to happen Wednesday night. Wednesday night, our modeler is going to be Al Judy. Al's another excellent modeler.
ON30.
He's an ON30 guy. He has some of the most detailed scenes. They're just exquisite. And Al has a philosophy about building his scenes and building his model railroad that I really think you're going to find exciting. So I hope if you get a chance, you'll come back.
That's this Wednesday?
Yes, sir, at 7 o'clock. And it'll be posted on my Facebook page in the morning with a link, just like this link. And all you got to do is click on the link and you're back with us.